This is Steve from After Effects VFX. I hope all of you are having a great day. I'm going to go through the Cyborg project that I loaded up earlier. A few people are interested on sort of the compositing of things. So it's not going to be well, it's a full tutorial, but it's not going to be a breakdown button by button of what I've done. It's going to be a generalization of how I put the scene together, and then going back more into the compositing. So here's what we're going to do. Okay, so here in After Effects, I've set up a composition about 7 seconds long, applied element 3D, and I'm just going to go into the scene setup. Okay, so here we're in the scene setup. And what I've brought in a model from productioncrate.com, which is the worker droid, and it's a bit like a sort of cyborg. And I've taken this model into Miximo, where I've added an animation, basically of it just sort of hanging about, really. Reassign the textures, so we've got the base color, the metallic texture, the roughness. Now in here, the illumination, I've loaded in the droid emission, and if you go down to the droid, the illumination, and you bring down its intensity, if you see, it's to do more with the eyes up here. So if you ever have an emissive channel in Element, I tend to put that in the illumination channel. Now, because it's going to be a sort of rainy scene, obviously when you've got metal, it does tend to look very sort of shiny. So with the glossiness, I've sort of put the glossiness up 100%, fiddled around with this to get the sort of thing I like the most. And what else have I done on it? And also increase the reflectivity, because again, when things get wet, it gets shinier and you can see more. Now with the normal bump, what I've done, if I turn it on, it's actually like what we call like a rain map. And if I go into here, you can see it's got some sort of rain pattern, but and it's converted to a bump map, which is important. I'm just going to click OK a minute and just go. I've loaded it up here. I've imported it, and if I just solo it for a second, and you can see that it's got a rain sort of pattern to it. You can find these on the internet and everything like that, but I've loaded that into the normal channel, so it will help to reflect or sort of show up. Make sure this comes up again. So it will come up on this model in its normal channel, sort of rain sort of effect. Okay, I'm just gonna go into Element 3D again as well, and how to get these things into Element to make it easier is you've got a custom layers, and I've loaded up the map into layer 2, and I've loaded this image here into custom layer 1. And what this, I'm just going to solo, this is the storm cloud image that I brought in. I've just sort of blurred it with fast blur and about 3 pixel blur, and the one underneath it is basically the same image, but no blur to it at all. Okay, so we've got the background and we've got the element layer there. So, and I've also got a parallel light, which I'm just going to click on, which is coming up from here and just giving us some sort of shading to this area, which is where I want my light source to come from. Right, so back into Element 3D for a sec. One important thing I want to mention, it's about a lot of models actually, that they come in and they look fine, and you render them out and you suddenly notice you've got a hole. So a few things you should always do with every single model. So click on your model, and I've already done it here. I've gone down to optimize mesh, and what that does is gets rid of any faces, vertices that you don't really need, which will speed up in the render process. And also the other important thing as well, when you scroll right down here, is draw on back faces, because if I turn this off, there's actually a gap. If you look here, it's actually a gap, and I turn this back on and it comes there. So do be aware aware of that. Okay, right, and as I say, so for our environment, if I click on environment, I've loaded that custom layer 1, which was the storm clouds, into this, and automatically you can see it picks up some of the colour. So let's just click OK. So let's see where we are at the moment. We've got the Cyborg here, got a camera which is literally just doing a little camera move just to add a little bit of interest, nothing major, a couple of keyframes. Okay, so that's sort of stage 1. Okay, so the next sort of stage for me is on the Element 3D layer. I wanted to give this a little bit more of a glow around here. So I've used, it's a third-party plugin called Universe Glow, and I've just fiddled around with these settings a little bit. It's just because that sort of nice sort of diffuse sort of look to it if I turn it on and off. So we're going to go into our element because I want to get this ready to render, and I only actually want to render the robot itself. I will be turning the background layer off, and it will make things a lot more easier later on when we do the sort of composite. I'm just going to turn it back on for a second. There we are. So we go into element. We're just going to go through some of the settings. So let's go through the render settings. I want the shadows, and I've enabled them to ray traced, and they will just load up. It takes a little time. It's quite a heavy model. There we go. And we go to ambient occlusion. I'll keep it on defaults. I'll just again want ambient occlusion ray traced. And you'll start to see that that will bring in the connect shadows. We're going to scroll down, and we're going to go to the reflection. I've got the reflection map at 512, so it's quite a high map for the reflection. Go to glow, and I'm going to enable glow. You see that just brings out the eyes a little bit more. I'll set the intensity to 2. Output, I've left it again at its defaults. It doesn't really need any sort of extra sampling. So, okay, I'm just going to close that all down, and I'm going to turn off my background layer, and we'll be back when I've rendered this out. See you in a minute. Okay, so the next thing we're going to start to work on is just adding a couple of other elements, and then working on some of the color corrections. So we've got the Cyborg here. I've got the stormy clouds just reload up. I'm just going to drop in a movie file of sort of rain footage, and I'm going to actually just scale that right up. Now I want one in front, and I want one behind. So if this is going to be the front one, and I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to take one right underneath the Cyborg model. Now I'm going to disable the top one just for a second, and we can also set its mode to screen, but this is meant to be behind, so it does need to have a little bit of blur to it. So I'm going to do fast box blur, repeat H pixels was important, give it maybe, let's say 4 pixels, maybe 3, okay, that'll do. And then with this one, which is in front, we're going to set it to screen as well, but just offset the timing so that the rain pattern isn't exactly the same. Okay, it's nice. Start to do a little bit of color correction. Now color correction for me is all about tying everything together so that it's in the same place. When you get to color grading, it's more like creating a mood, creating a theme, giving you that sort of feeling. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to add an adjustment layer. New adjustment layer with a tint on it, just to get rid of the color a second. So first thing, let's put over the Cyborg, there we are. Just make sure, oh, put it on the wrong layer, so I'll just copy that, adjustment layer, edit, paste, and delete it off the Cyborg layer. Okay, so if we look at this image as a whole, we can see the blacks look very, very dark. compared to the general background. So what I like to do is if I go onto the Cyborg, and I've added the curves here, and first of all I've gone into the RGB channel, and if I click it on, I've just brought it up a little bit, and you can see that the blacks do look like a lot more like they tie in if I turn it off, on, off, on. So that's the first thing, I'm matching the black levels. And the reason I'm putting the tint on there as well, so you're not getting confused by the colour. Excuse me. I've posted a tutorial about sort of another way of colour correcting by looking at things differently. So looking at the darks first, the black and whites, then looking at the hues, looking at the saturation. So maybe go and have a look at that to get a better understanding. Now, granted that most of the colours in this image are very similar, so you're not going to see a lot of changes through when I go through the red channel. Go down here to the red, and you would adjust things accordingly just to make it look like it matches in the black background, and you go through each channel accordingly. Let's put this back to RGB. So here we are with SuperComp loaded up, and the first thing I want to do is go into the Cyborg main, and I'm going to add a colour correction. This again is to do with matching the blacks in the background. Now this is going to be overload because we've actually matched it quite well, so you know it really has gone quite high. So I would tend to then bring this down to about 20%. Let's bring this down a bit. There we are, click on and off. Maybe keep it at 30%. Yeah, that's great. Right, the next thing is I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to add a light wrap. And what light wrap does is actually brings some of the background over the foreground object. Now, even though we used a HDRI so that some of that light will encompass around the object, you do find just with a little bit more light wrap just helps to sort of sell the idea. And very often with SuperComp I keep it near enough at its defaults, to be honest with you. And I'm going to add a reverse light wrap, which again adds some of the foreground, adds it through into the background to get more of a blend. I wanted a little bit of a haze onto the thing as well. And as far as the background is concerned, I just actually wanted to add a haze to that just a little bit there. Okay, so let me close that down a second. Let me turn SuperComp off on. Again, it just sort of starts to tie things together. But what you may have noticed, though, it has blown out one of my rain layers. So I'm just going to edit, duplicate, and just throw that over the top. There we are, and that brings it back. And again, doing on and off. These things are subtle, but it does help to sell. Also turn it on first. Does help to sell. Now, if you notice, it does look quite low contrasty, and I tend to do that with a lot of my images. But it all does tie together. But I do this so that I have a lot more control when it comes to the final sort of color grading, if you like. So I'm going to render this out and then move back in for the last part for the color grading. Okay, so now we're going to look at the color grading and just a few other things. So sometimes I like to add, just because I've got the light, if you remember I had my light coming from this way, I just like to add something else to tie it in and just that little bit more. It's going to be very, very subtle, but for me I do find it helps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do layer, new, solid, and I've already picked sort of a background color for this. Let's just go up here a bit more there. Just pull it up a bit. Okay. And I'm just going to turn it off for a second. Then I'm going to get my marquee tool for the ellipse, and I'm just going to draw an ellipse just so it encompasses part of the shoulder. And I'm just going to bring it over part of the head. I'm going to sort of make sure that's, yeah, okay, that's cool. Okay, then I'm going to turn the layer back on again, and I'm going to do effects, noise, and grain. Add some noise to it. Let's just bring it up a little bit. Not too much. About, I don't know, let's say about 14%. Then I'm going to go to the mask, go to the feather. I'm going to feather the hell out of it. With this, I do want to again just increase the size. I do want the top of the head included a little bit. Okay. Then I'm going to turn it to screen and drop its opacity right down to 0. And then I'm just gonna turn the mask off for a second, and then I'm just gonna bring it up just a little bit, just so it brings in just that. It's not too much, but just a little bit of extra light. I'm gonna turn it on and off. You can see it's very, very subtle, but again, I just think that helps with the compositing. Okay, now I want to have a bit of light flicker, so I'm going to add layer, new, solid, and let's call this Twitch. Now again, this is another third-party plugin from video. This one's from Video Copilot. Now again, this makes things a lot easier, but you could do something where you flicker the opacity on and off, on and off, on and off, and you'd create the same thing. So I go to enable. I'm just looking at the light behavior, light controls, and I want the light. I think I want it to be about 0.5 twitches a second, and I'm going to go for 25 the light amount, and this should have been applied to an adjustment layer, so bear with me. Copy a layer, new adjustment layer. I'll put this adjustment layer here, and edit, paste. There we are. Okay, so let's just have a quick look and see what that dash gives us. I'm just going to bring it down to a 2-second render. Just play this a second. This is going to simulate a little bit of, if you like, lightning. Let's just let it run just a little bit more. Let it get up to 2 seconds. Here we go. There we are. We've got some lightning sort of coming alive there. Okay, so I'm going to get these now, these 3 layers. I'm just going to pre-compose them just to keep things sort of tidy, if you like, and I'll just call this Cyborg. And now we're going to go into the sort of color grading. So the first one I'm doing is I'm just doing levels. Now, well, sometimes I find that, especially if you're doing, say, like an underwater scene, which does tend to be very, very low in contrast, but a lot of images do need to have a balance of the shadows, the midtones, and highlights. So if I just move these out of the way a second, just sort of spread them out again, and I'll turn this layer on. And if you watch, I'll bring the shadow, make sure the shadows just come to this point, the highlights are just coming to where the highlights should be. And if I turn this on and off, you can just start to see it looks a little bit more punchier. The next layer I've got is a magic bullet looks, and if I go into edit here, it does sometimes take a few seconds to load magic bullet looks, and sometimes it crashes. Which one is it going to be today? Oh, it hasn't crashed. Right. So I've gone into looks, and I'm just using one of the pre-installed LUTs, which is lookup tables. If anyone's interested, let's see if it's going to come up. Yeah, so I think I used Cape Town. I think was the one I used, and I kept it at its defaults. Again, there are various ones you can go through and see. You know, you can play around with this for hours. And I never keep any effect really up to 100%. You know, I tend to find 80 to 90% is great. For this particular look, I wanted 90%. The next one I've added is a Sharpen. I've used Boris Sapphire Sharpen and brought the opacity down. I think I brought it down to 80% and turn that on. All images do need to have a little bit of sharpen, especially when you want it to have a little bit of punch. Again, many blurs and sharpens out there, so feel free to use which one you want. And the last one is just adding a little bit of noise. So I use Renoiser, and if I go into this, let me just go into Renoiser a second. Where are we? Yeah, so I've picked a more than 35mm camera with just left it at the default for the grain, and that just tends to tie things together even more. And it's important when you're using digital objects with backgrounds that have been shot with real cameras. It's always handy if you can find out what camera it was shot with or what film footage to match it even better. But again, it just makes things look a little bit more believable. And so basically, guys, that's it. I hope it's been some help. Any questions, do please leave a comment. It's always really appreciated. And I'll catch you on the next time round. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.